You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to get into a bit more opinion scholarship. It's been a long time coming, actually, and a little bit of an interesting tale. This may be the last or second to last episode of the Two Tongues Podcast Season 4. So we're wrapping up 4 years of doing the show, 4 years of opinion scholarship, and 4 years of interesting chats with Kyle. If you guys remember, a couple years ago, I think 2-ish years ago, I was getting into this little book here called The Red Book by Carl Jung. We did 7 episodes on it a couple years ago, and then we just sort of stopped. Because my interests are taking me in lots of different places and just kind of stopped. So I don't know if you're excited about getting back into this or if you've forgotten all about it. But in any case, we're going to dig in. This is really, really interesting stuff. I think it's probably worthwhile to give you a little bit of a summary, at least talking about what Carl Jung is doing when he generates the stories that we're going to read in the Red Book. You don't have to listen to all 7 episodes that we did 2 years ago. By the way, those are all called Gandalf the Red, Part 1, Part 2, and so on. This today is Gandalf the Red, Part 8. If you're wondering where Gandalf the Red came from, well, this is just the idea of when I started, like when I got introduced to Carl Jung, I was introduced to this cutting edge psychologist who had a whole new theory who kind of left Freud behind in the dust and got, very mystical, and all this stuff is very interesting to me. And so my image of Carl Jung changed from reading his academic books through reading some of his pupils. If you remember, we did a bunch of episodes on some of his pupils, and then starting to read the Red Book, because the Red Book is the origin of all of the academic books that he wrote and all the lectures that he gave and all of those sorts of things, the depth psychology that we get from Carl Jung. And the image of him as an academic slowly started to change for me to more of a sage, right? He was mystical, so he becomes kind of a mystic in my mind. And the imagery that comes with mysticism is like, for me, it's like D&D characters, mages in robes with a hood on and, a long white beard, Gandalf kind of characters, Dumbledore kind of characters, something like that. Maybe there's a couple of Caravaggio paintings that I really like that are Saint Jerome. And it's just like this old man cloistered in a cave somewhere by candlelight, reading the Bible and studying. And he's like wearing a red cloak, and he's got this big gray beard. He looks like a sage, like a wise man, like a mysterious wise man who lives far away from society. But if you ever had the luck of bumping into him, you're going to have at your disposal some deep wisdom that you might absorb through osmosis from such a character. And so Carl Jung became more of a sage, more of that type of a character to me. And the Red Book is what did it. So just to tee it up, from 1913-ish to around 1932, Carl Jung was doing these experiments with himself. He called these experiments active imagination. If you've listened to the other episodes, you've heard this explanation before, but let me just give you the summary version. Carl Jung understood that there's an unconscious component to his existence. There's something that it means to have consciousness, and there's something that it also means to have unconsciousness, and the two things seem to go together. It's not clear how they separate. It's like we live in a way that's conscious, and that's what we give most credence to, and we give most value to the things we hear and touch and experience and all interact with and all of that. But then there's this unconscious component to our lives, and we dismiss it because it's hidden from us. That's kind of why we call it unconscious. You might as well just call it hidden from us. Whatever it is, we can call it unconscious all we want, but we don't really know what that means. To be unconscious of something is to be unaware of it. It's hidden from us. It's a mystery. But we know it exists because we have this weird thing where we fall asleep and we have these crazy dreams. And the dreams are full of images, and the images are not from reality. And if you're really good at that, like Carl Jung was, You can interact with the images in your dreams. You can get information from them that you don't have. It's a mystery. And people say this sort of thing about dreams. They're thinking about a problem they can't solve. It's some intractable problem at work. They have a couple of dreams and suddenly they crack it, But there is another level to the unconscious that's more down to earth. We can talk about these sort of numinous things like where our dreams come from, where our values come from, where our interests come from. It's not hard to, or not easy to say. But what about things that are unconscious in us? Like the process of our thinking. The thing in us that continues to breathe our lungs for us, right? You're not doing that consciously. There's a whole unconscious component to our lives. All of the activity that's going on in the cells in my body, I'm not conscious of that. All of the bacteria and viruses and things that are living in me, I'm like an ecosystem of all these things working together and I'm not conscious of any of it. So we're forced to admit that there's this unconscious component to our lives. And what Carl Jung realized is that that's something that can be mined, like mining for gold in the earth. The unconscious is something that's attached to us that maybe is us in some way. But either way, we have access to it. And once we stop ignoring it, we realize maybe there's some value to that. Right? Maybe I can be more active in my dreaming. If it's information I'm looking for, if it's something that the unconscious knows that I don't, maybe I can be more active in that pursuit. I'm not just like, floating through my dream, not in control of what's happening and not being able to take advantage of opportunities to plumb the depths of my mind. Carl Jung realized, no, the unconscious is a thing. It's intimately attached to us, and we can plumb its depths, and there are things in there that are valuable. Maybe everything comes from it. And Carl Jung believed that consciousness arises from the unconscious. So the unconscious is sort of the mother of consciousness. It's where consciousness comes from. So what Carl Jung did was he had these experiments with himself. Now, I want you to know that Carl Jung was extremely open. His personality was extremely open, and he was extremely visual. So his brain probably worked different from mine and yours. It's certainly different from mine. And he had, if you ever talk to somebody that has the ability to lucid dream, you might have some idea of what Carl Jung was able to do. He was deeply introspective, deeply creative, deeply open. And so his mind was able to do things that I don't think are easy for most people to do, and it might be hard to imagine. But if you think about this like a dream, it makes some sense. But Carl Jung was not dreaming when he did this. And when I keep saying this, what I mean is this practice, this kind of meditative practice that Carl Jung called active imagination. So imagine in your waking state, being able to put yourself into a dreamlike state while you're still conscious and aware. So you're in this dreamlike state, but almost awake in it, able to control it, able to be aware that you can control it, that you have some agency in that imaginative space. So that's a little different from a dream. Imagine taking the reins of your dream and controlling it, like those people I mentioned that can do that. This is what Carl Jung would do. And he would have images arising in his head. He would have whole scenes of things arising in his head. And the more he practiced this active imagination, the better and better he got at it. People say the same thing about lucid dreaming. If you practice it, you get better and better at it. You get more control over it. You're more aware during the experience. And this is what Carl Jung managed to do through this years and years long practice of this weird type of meditation, lucid dreaming sort of thing. And eventually, he got to the point where it wasn't just landscapes and symbols that were appearing to him, but it was like other people that you would encounter in a dream. And he can interact with them. He can talk to them. He can ask them questions. He can probe things. He can follow them around and see what they do. He can really do some interesting things. And he knows that all of these images are coming from his unconscious. All of these images mean something to him, and they mean something real. So all he has to do is find out what they mean. And it's like unlocking a code. It's like learning to read this book of the unconscious that seems to contain maybe all the information, right? Maybe all the information, but certainly information that's important to him. All right, so without further ado, Jung did not understand, or at least fully understand, the meaning behind the visions, symbols, and information gleaned from active imagination. He did, however, admit that the entirety of his life's work in depth psychology was contained in them, even before he consciously understood them. Like, this was like a massive download for him over a period of years from this great mystery of the unconscious. It stands out starkly in the Red Book because all of the imagery and entities are clearly symbolic, but their meaning is not evident, even to Jung. Right? Like I said, he probes, he asks questions to these symbols. These like living symbols in his mind. He's trying to understand them, right? He's literally asking them questions. He's looking at this symbol. He doesn't know what it means. Imagine having the ability to then ask your dream, what do you mean? And have a dialogue with it. This is the kind of thing that Jung's doing. So what do these symbols mean? I read the Red Book, seeking the meaning, playing with symbols and associations, like any good depth psychologist would. And since the Red Book reads like a work of mythology, and you'll see it, it's strange, we will read and interpret it as mythology. Like Dante's trip to the Inferno, the adventures of Odysseus, or Rumpelstiltskin spinning straw into gold. We will read the Red Book as deep, unconscious meaning, encoded, so to speak, in story. And these stories, these visions that we're going to look at, today there's going to be 4 of them. So let's start with the first, which I'm going to call the magic word. Now I'm going to give you some pieces here that are just summarizing bits of the story to kind of get us to the valuable areas. So I'm going to skip big chunks of this, but just to understand that. So first thing I'm going to do is introduce this first vision, and then we'll get into the actual text. So Jung finds himself in a vast desert, tired, lost, and thirsty. He discovers footsteps in the sand, and he just follows them to see if he can find where they go, who they belong to. And he ends up finding a Christian ascetic, like a hermit, a guy living out, a religious person living out in the desert by himself. And he calls this person the anchorite. He learns that the anchorite lives a solitary life in a cave with only one of the Gospels to keep him company. And Jung remarks that he must have read it 1,000 times and know it by heart. To which the anchorite replies that a book contains a new meaning at each reading. A book contains a new meaning at each reading. Now that's probably a sentiment that makes some sense to you. If you grew up similar to myself with Christian parents or grandparents, you might have heard this too, that reading the Bible, reading these scriptures is something that transforms. The meaning of it transforms as you mature mentally and spiritually, you might say. Reading the same passage, you get something different from it. And, you can understand that. I mean, even if you have a favorite novel and you've read it a bunch of times, you understand what he's getting at. A book contains a new meaning at each reading. And it reminds me of one of those pre-Socratic philosophers that we talked about a while ago, named Heraclitus, who said famously, "No man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he is not the same man." Right? It seems to have the same meaning as a book contains a new meaning at each reading. Like, he is not the same man. So there's this idea of meaning and symbols being alive in a way. When I say that they're alive, I mean they're alive like us. They change, they grow, they mature, they transform. And so symbols and meaning have this quality that human beings have. Meaning is alive and changing because we, and you might say the archetypes within us, are alive and changing. So that brings me to the beginning of the text here. So just understand, the scene opens up. Carl Jung is talking to this anchorite, this fella in the desert. He makes this off the cuff remark that he only has the one book. He probably knows it by heart. And the anchorite takes umbrage to that. He's like, no. A book contains new meaning at each reading. And so the anchorite says this: a succession of words does not have only one meaning, but men strive to assign only a single meaning in order to have an unambiguous language. This striving is worldly and constricted and belongs to the deepest layers of the divine creative plan. Only to the all-knowing is it given to know all the meanings. Only to the all-knowing, right? Only God knows all the meanings. All right, so he gives him this warning. He's like, look, the gospel that I'm reading doesn't have just one meaning, but this is more important. This is more broadly applicable. Like, things don't have just one meaning. You don't have just one meaning. The world doesn't have just one meaning, but men want one meaning. He said men strive for it. They only want a single meaning assigned. Otherwise, they don't know shit, right? Then they have an ambiguous language where nothing means anything concrete. So we strive to limit the meaning, to make it something that we can wrap our brains around, to make it something we can understand. And then he says this thing like only the all-knowing is given to know all the meanings, which says something like we as human beings, as finite creatures, are limited in what we can understand. But there's far more, maybe an infinite amount, that's there to be understood. Only God knows that. But we are limited. So there's this idea that concealing the infinite or infinity or infinite meaning in something finite, like a word or a symbol, but even so, making something finite, infinite rather, in something finite, like trying to constrain meaning in the word. How is that among the deepest layers of the divine plan, right? This is what he says. The striving is worldly and constricted and belongs to the deepest layers of the divine plan. So this idea of containing the infinite in the finite somehow is among the deepest layers of God's divine plan. What does that mean? It seems like somehow the constriction of the infinite is necessary for experience to be possible. It's like if things really have infinite meaning, we can't wrap our brains around infinite meaning. So we have to constrain it. And there was a philosopher named Henri Bergson who famously talked about this as it pertains to consciousness. He believed that human consciousness was a reducing valve. Like it functions as a reducing valve, taking all this infinite complexity of the world, or infinite meaning, and narrowing it down to something that's manageable, something that allows experience or understanding to be possible. Consciousness does that. And presumably, the conscious experience is part of the divine plan. Otherwise, conscious experience wouldn't exist, right? Like we exist as conscious creatures with this experience of the world because that's how the world was made, right? That's what God intended. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. Like if you're a theist, if you believe in God and that the world unfolds by God's plan, then of course conscious experience must be part of that. And if that requires constricting God somehow, or constricting the infinite, well, I don't really see a difference between saying God and the infinite, so forgive me. But that constricting it is somehow part of the plan. Like God wants to be constricted. like the infinite wants to be made finite. Now, when he says only the all-knowing is given to know all the meanings, I have to point out all the meanings. It's like to have all meaning is to have no particular meaning, right? To have all the meaning is very different than having one particular meaning. If you see what I mean, to have all the meaning is almost like having no meaning at all, because all of the meaning is no particular meaning, if that makes some sense. But meaning must be particular, right? All meaning is something like undifferentiated. It's something like everything piled together. It loses its coherence. It loses its meaning, right? And so it's unknowable. So this idea of the all meaning, or the infinite, or God, choose your word there. It's something like unconscious potential, right? All meaning is no particular meaning, so it's like the potential for meaning, and that has to be, in order to draw out a particular meaning from this infinite sea of meaning, there has to be some limiting, there has to be some constricting. You have to have Bergson's reducing valve, something like that. And that's what consciousness is to Bergson. And this is what Jung is interested in. What is consciousness? What is the unconscious? All right, so as the conversation between Jung and the anchorite progresses, the anchorite starts telling him about himself. He confesses to Jung that he used to be a philosopher and a teacher before he decided to become a hermit. And he brings up Philo of Alexandria. If you don't know Philo, it's okay. It's just a first century Jewish Hellenic philosopher, famous philosopher from the first century. So he brings up Philo, and he says this: he was a clever head, but fantastically abstract. He was a slave of his own words. I added my own and wove an atrocious web of words in which I ensnared not only my listeners, but also myself. We rioted terribly among words and names, our own miserable creatures, and accorded divine potency to them. Yes, we even believed in their reality and believed that we possessed the divine and had committed it to words. It is to Philo's credit that he furnished language like so many other philosophers. But words should not become gods. All right, so there's a lot there, but really powerful confession from the anchorite, because what he's saying is strange. Right? Remember, the anchorite is a symbol in Carl Jung's imagination. And this symbol has a backstory, and this symbol has its own regrets. I just want you to understand how strange that is, how fully fleshed out this symbolic being is in Carl Jung's imagination. It's not just he encounters someone like you have a dream and you go, and you were there, and you didn't look like you, but you were there. No. The anchorite has a backstory, right? And he has his own intentions and will. It's very strange for a symbol. It's a living symbol. And so when he says that Philo made this mistake, like he was a great philosopher and he calls him a word artist, and he says he comes up with words that can be used successfully, but the words themselves are empty. And so this is why he warns not to become a slave to words. It's like you can come up with a concept and you can commit yourself to that concept. And if that concept is wrong or incomplete and you attach yourself and you buy in, full scale to that thing, you're making a huge mistake. You're living in la la land, not in reality. So you have to be careful not to become a slave to words. And then he says that he's as guilty of that as Philo. He said, I added my own and wove an atrocious web of words in which I ensnared not only my listeners, but also myself. There's something like a confession here. Like this character is saying, I was made a slave to words. I came up with the words and became a slave to them. I bought into them, and I was wrong. And so I wonder whether that's not what Carl Jung himself at this point in his life was thinking. I've been thinking deeply. I've been coming up with these ideas like archetypes and the collective unconscious and all these things. And I don't know how much these words accord with reality. And am I letting myself get too attached to them? Am I going too far down that rabbit hole where I'm losing touch with reality? And he doesn't have a way of knowing. This is partly what he's doing in active imagination. This is the problem he's trying to solve. And it acts itself out in this dramatic way between this conversation between Jung and the anchorite. And he says, we rioted terribly among words and names, our own miserable creatures. And I imagine myself spending the last few years trying to toy around with the idea of God, trying to come up with models that make sense to me, that help to tie things together and that accord with my own mystical experience. I've been doing that, and this idea of playing around with words and images, trying to understand something that's difficult or impossible to understand. Like, this is what he was doing. This is what he's admitting to. He says, we rioted terribly among words in which I ensnared my listeners and myself. So he's guilty of making a symbol or a compelling argument that's wrong, but it's influencing other people and it's influencing himself, and he's buying into it. And so he's cautioning us against that. When he says, he calls the words that he invented, these philosophical words, that we're going to start talking about the logos in a minute, but that's one idea. He's like, when he comes up with these philosophical words, he calls them his own miserable creatures, right? A word that he created, right? It's one of his creatures, and it's miserable because it's incomplete, right? Because it's wrong, because it doesn't capture the reality he's trying to capture. And it reminds me of a famous line from the Tao Te Ching, the ancient Chinese Taoist text, a religious text, that says the Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao, right? The Tao is this idea of the way or God, let's say. There are people who will argue with that, but let's say God. That you can't put a word to it, because the moment you say it's this, you're wrong. The moment you open your mouth, you're wrong. You're not capturing what God is. You're not capturing what the Tao is. So it can't be spoken of. And this is how words may be misleading or empty. And even so, people will be influenced by them. People will be attracted to them. And we're gonna find out why that is as we keep reading. He says that he gave these words divine potency. He says, yes, we even believed in their reality. We believed it, We believed we'd captured the meaning of them in these words. We succeeded in doing that. And he says, and we believed we possessed the divine and had committed it to words. Now, to say that you possessed the divine and committed it to words, to me, kind of seems like we have this jar. I don't know if you were a kid, if you collected fireflies or lightning bugs, you put them in a jar. It's something like that. It's like we have this jar that we possess. This is the word or the symbol. And we've shoved God into it, tightened the lid up. We've contained it, contained this infinite thing in this jar. Now we can see it. Now we know what it is. And now, and even better, we possess it. It's ours now. We've got it. And the arrogance of this is what comes through. This is the sin of Lucifer. This is the sin of arrogance, of presuming to be God. This is the way that Christians understand this sin of Lucifer. And this is what he's doing. He thinks he succeeded in taking the infinite, right? That's what I'm going to call God. If God is nothing else, it's infinite. And I'm going to capture it. I'm going to come up with a word or a series of words or a book or whatever it is. And it takes a beginning cap and an end cap, and it just encapsulates this infinite thing that we call God. Bullshit you are. You may think you have, but you're wrong. And a way I like to try to illustrate this is mathematically, with this example of pi. So we have this concept, the Greek letter pi, and it corresponds in mathematics to a relationship among a circle. We all know about this, 3.14, right? This is what pi represents. But we know that's not quite true, because pi is this strange number where those decimal the numbers after the decimal place actually just rattle on forever. It's not 3.14. It's actually 3.1415, but it's not that either. It's 3.1415 and on and on and on you go forever. Right? So we think that when we come up with this symbol that we call pi, and we write those two little lines with a squiggle on top, we think we've captured it. We've captured pi. We've captured this number. Once again, I say, bullshit you have. You know what we do? We just round it off at 3.14 and pretend that we've captured this infinite number, which we have not. The symbol pi does not capture the number. It does not capture the reality. And this is how words are dangerous. And he says, it is to Philo's credit that we have furnished language like so many other philosophers, but words should not become gods. Right? Words are representations of the thing. They are not the thing itself. And many philosophers have talked about this, the distinction between the noumena, the thing itself, and the phenomena, the thing that represents it. When we look out at the world around us, many people believe that we are looking at a phenomena, that we're looking at a symbol. And everything in our reality is a symbol. Now, there's something behind that symbol. That's what we call the noumena. Those are the ones and zeros behind the matrix. There's something behind the symbols, but we don't have access to that thing. We only have access to the representation. So again, words are representations. They're not the thing itself. And what we're interested in, what Jung is interested in, is the thing itself. What is the noumena? What is the ones and zeros behind the matrix? Is this something to do with the unconscious? And here's the thing. We prefer the representations. We want them. We prefer them. We want the symbol pi. I don't want this infinite stream of numbers that I can do nothing with, because I don't even know where it ends. It doesn't end. It's like a concept that has meaning that goes on forever, right? There's something about that's numinous and divine, isn't there? We don't want that. That's too hard. That's too scary. We don't want that. Right? What we want is it constrained. We want something that we can make sense of. We want something we can put in a jar and possess. Why? Because it's easier. It's simpler. But here's the question. At what cost? If we're satisfied with the symbol, what we're doing is trading in the real thing for something false and empty. For an idol, right? If you're a Christian, you might understand that symbology of idol worship, right? Or if you're Platonic, if you're a fan of Plato, we're trading in the real thing for shadows on the cave wall, if that makes sense. And this conversation about words and meaning is interesting. I did an episode, I think in season 1, about the postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida. Those were some interesting episodes. Derrida has this concept called différance, if you remember. And the idea is super postmodern. Like it illustrates what postmodernism is all about. Différance is this idea that Derrida pointed out, where he said that words don't seem to have a meaning. Symbols don't seem to have a meaning. What they do have is an infinite deferral of meaning. Strange, right? Right? He says, you can say something like, I don't know a great example to use, but one I've used in the past is like something like the sun. Like the sun is a word, it has meaning. But if I ask you what the word sun means, the best you're going to be able to do is start giving me other words that have similar meanings, right? You might say, burning ball of gas. You might say heat. You might say, light. You might say all kinds of things. But all of those words just describe this other word that you already gave me when you said sun. You see what I mean? And then if you ask me, okay, well, what does burning ball of gas mean? What does heat mean? What does light mean? What do I have at my disposal but other words to try to explain what those words mean? And you can start to see the infinite deferral of meaning. right? If I can't tell you what sun means without using other words, and I can't tell you what those other words mean without using other words, where's the meaning? It becomes like sand through your fingers. And this is an interesting point that the postmodernists brought to us. But what's strange about this to me, and I think is symbolically super significant, is if symbols and words really have no meaning, at least by themselves, they seem maybe like we would say that they're meaningless. But at the same time, we have all of these associations that we just talked about, right? With sun, we get ball of gas, we get ball, we get gas, we get heat, we get light, we get all of these things. So the words might not have meaning by themselves, but what they do have is an infinite stream of associations. And I don't know where that stops. I can keep asking, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? Forever and ever and ever. So something like a symbol has no meaning and somehow infinite associations. You might say it has no meaning and all meaning. It's very, very strange. And it's paradoxical. And you might just want to brush that off and wonder why I'm even bringing it up. But symbolically, this idea of the union of opposites, an idea that people like Jordan Peterson will call the Ouroboros, Carl Jung called the syzygy, that there is this ancient religious symbol of God that is, at its simplest level, understood as the union, the divine union of opposites, this paradoxical union of opposites. And this is what we see in Derrida's description of meaning in words. And it makes you wonder if words are symbols. I just a minute ago alluded to the fact that the phenomenal world, the world around us, may very well be symbols. What might be common there? You know, is a human being a symbol that has no meaning, but is attached to an association of infinite meaning? And that's only a tiptoe away from saying something religious. Is a human being an empty husk filled by the infinite God, animated by the infinite itself? I mean, if you've listened to this podcast before, you know how I will answer that question. So I'll leave that a mystery for those who maybe are listening for the first time. Let's push on. All right, Jung says, after all this talk about words and being, resisting becoming a slave to words and how they're empty and deceiving and all this, Jung says, well, doesn't it say in the gospel God was the Word? Okay, right? In the beginning was the Word, right? And so the anchorite says, I ask you, was this logos a concept, a word? So again, this is where we're going to start getting into one of these philosophical words. The Greek word logos just means word. This is where we get that from the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the logos. And the logos means something. It means word, but it also means something like order. And so the anchorite asks, is that a word? Is the logos a word? He says, he just kind of answers his own question. He says, it was a man and lived among men, right? So he's referring to the incarnation. He's referring to Jesus. He's a religious man, the anchorite, of course. You expect that. He says, you see, Philo only lent John the word. John gave the meaning of the logos, but Philo gave logos as a dead concept that usurped life, even the divine life. Whew. See what he's doing there? He's like, Philo gave us this word, the logos. Until logos was an embodied being, until Jesus Christ was existing on the earth, that's an empty word. And if you use the word in the absence of the reality of either Jesus or, the way that Gospel of John paints it is that Jesus or the logos was there in the beginning. So maybe this eternal thing, that this is a concept, logos, that constricts this infinite thing that really is God, right? And by doing that, he says that the concepts usurp life, even the divine life. Like with the word logos, I'm trying to describe God. And by using the word, right, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao. When I use that word logos, I'm attempting to shove God into a jar labeled logos. That robs God of its eternity, of its infinity. It robs God of what makes God God. He's saying it robs the divine life. See, this is the caution. This is the caution. A word constricts the infinite. Gives it only one meaning. That's what we want. That helps us to understand. Make it simple. When what it is infinite. It's not something that can be put in a jar. It's not something that can be contained by a word or concept. And the anchorite says, through this the dead does not gain life, and the living is killed. Right? Through exchanging this word logos for the true living logos, for being satisfied with this contained word that's simple and easy to understand, rather than recognizing the reality that's bursting out of the seams of that word that cannot be contained and cannot be understood. You see what I mean? Who would want to contend with that infinite, terrible, thing when you could instead have a nice little package called logos with a bow on it, with a beginning and an end that's easy to understand? This is a risk. This is something that's easy to do, that we want to do as human beings, and we have to be very cautious of, because you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. He's saying that the meaning of the logos is killed in the symbol. Like the symbol is only a facsimile. Do you want God, or do you want the facts of God? You see what I mean? And the anchorite, lastly, he admits, he says, and this was also my atrocious error. And again, I can't help but think the anchorite is an image, a symbol in Jung's imagination. So when he says, this was also my atrocious error, I think that's an admission of Jung saying, I've done this. This is something I have done. I have got lost in a web of words, trying to understand this infinite thing, and I'm getting nowhere. All right, so the anchorite ends the conversation because the day is starting to wind down. The day in the vision is starting to wind down, and he puts Jung up for the night in a rock-cut grave. Remember, he lives in the desert and in the mountains, and so that's where he puts Jung up for the night. And the next morning, they resume their discussion. What I want to point out before we get into their next discussion, because that's the next vision, is just the symbolism here. That Jung gets put to sleep for the night in a grave. Now, it is strange enough that he's already kind of in this dream state, and he's going to sleep in his dream state, but he's being put in a grave. And I just can't help but point out that sleeping in a grave makes waking up in that grave symbolic of resurrection, right? Somebody's coming out of the grave. And this is a theme that we will see over and over and over again in Jung's work and in the Red Book about being reborn or resurrected. It's very critical for him. All right, it brings me to the second vision. I'm going to call this What the Word Points to. So first we did the magic word. Now we're doing What the Word Points to. All right, this one opens up kind of like a narration. It says, the solitary lives in endless desert full of awesome beauty. He looks at the whole and at inner meaning. He loathes manifold diversity. He looks at it from afar in its totality. All right, so this is just this opening scene of sort of like what it must be like to be this hermit living in the desert. Everything's beautiful. And what he's doing, what the anchorite is doing in his life and in his experience alone in the desert, is trying to experience or observe creation as a totality. He's trying to understand it as a totality, right? The universe is a giant system, and you're part of it. Just like I was saying, all the bacteria and cells and viruses and things in my body, they're all part of me. Okay, so this is the idea. He wants to experience this wholeness that he is a part of. And that's why it says he loathes manifold diversity. He doesn't want to focus on the individual things that make up the whole. That's going to get him far away from where he wants to be. He wants to experience the whole. Okay? He wants to look at it from afar in its totality. And I want to point out that to do that, like you are a subject. And what that means is that you are the lead role in the drama of your life. You're the star of the show. But it also means that all of your experiences are positioned, right? They're all coming at you, or you're looking out at them from a center. You are the center of your universe, right? Everything is in relationship to you and your experiences. That's how we are. But in order for you to see the totality, you really can't be a perspective, can you? In order to see the whole, you have to also be able to see yourself. You're a part of it. So to look at the totality, to experience the totality, requires that you separate yourself from yourself. I'm imagining like a near-death experiences where people say they're floating over their body in their hospital bed and they're looking down at themselves. This is what's required. For the anchorite to experience the totality, he has to come out of himself to see it. And so all of this talk here about the totality, I just want you to understand that it requires the loss of self. Like it's not possible if you are a subject, if you are the center. You have to become the all. You have to step outside of yourself. So it requires a loss of self. This is that death and rebirth situation that we just alluded to a moment ago when we were talking about resurrection and the symbol of Jung going to sleep in the grave and waking up a new man. Something like that. Now from here, the text gets italicized. A couple of paragraphs. And what that means is that in the prior chapters that we read years ago, we're introduced to these spirits, the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times. And when we get this italicized language, this is the spirit of the depths. And he's kind of doing this narration, just like we saw a moment ago. But it's important to understand that the spirit of the depths is like the spirit of all time. It's something like God. It's hard to describe on the spot, but it's like this numinous thing that knows everything, and he's sort of narrating from time to time, or he's slipping into the story here and there and saying something. And this is an example of that. So the spirit of the depths. Imagine this like somebody's inner thoughts, or maybe like a revelation of some kind. And the spirit of the depths says this. The sun and its eternal splendor replace for the solitary his own life warmth. Let me read that again. The sun and its eternal splendor replace for the solitary his own life warmth. His heart longs for the sun. He wanders to the lands of the sun. He dreams of the flickering splendor of the sun. The solitary seeks the sun. He needs little food, since the sun and its glow nourish him. Now, let me stop there for a second. So he's talking about the solitary. So he's talking about the anchorite, this guy that lives in the desert. But he's also talking about anybody that would remove themselves from everything to be solitary. But remember, we're in the desert, so the sun is an important image, and he's talking about this anchorite who lives there alone with nothing to keep him company but the desert and the sun. And he says, the sun has replaced his own life's warmth, like the warmth that radiates from my body. He said, that's no longer the warmth that radiates from the operation of his body, but it's sort of a reverberation or reflection of this warmth coming from the sun. Then he says, you might just say that means the sun is somehow in him, right? His heart longs for the sun, so the sun is like his aim, like that's what he longs for, what he's concentrating on, what he's working towards, the sun. It says he wanders the lands of the sun, right? So he lives with the sun. He wants to be with the sun. He dreams of the flickering splendor of the sun. So the sun not only is dominating his life, but also his unconscious, his dreams. It says he seeks the sun. He needs little food, right? Because he's being nourished by the sun. What I'm trying to say here is, or what the spirit of the depths is trying to say here, is that the solitary, the anchorite, is not really, there's no part of him that is himself anymore. It's all the sun. He's been replaced by the sun. The warmth in his body is the sun. His desires and aim is the sun. The place where he exists is the place of the sun. His dreams are filled with the sun. That's, he doesn't need to eat because he eats the sun. You see what I mean? He's the sun. And this is the first place that we start to see this like ancient Egyptian symbolism that starts to creep into the visions. You understand this, right? The ancient Egyptians worshipped Ra, Amun-Ra, right? The sun. They worshipped the sun. And so to say that the sun is in you and that you're eating the sun and living with the sun and dreaming about the sun and longing for the sun is to say something like God is in you and you live in God and your thoughts and dreams are God, right? There's this interesting way of reading this it is starting to reveal that the anchorite is living this solitary existence in order to come to this realization that what he is the sun. He's seeking God, and he needs to learn that he himself is God. God is in him. God is, is nourishing him. God is the place in which he exists. All of it is the sun. All of it is God. That's what's happening here. And the reason I know this is Egyptian symbolism starting to creep in is because we're going to see more of it as we go on. Another tidbit worth mentioning here, kind of mind-blowing, honestly, is this thing about he needs a little food since the sun nourishes him. You might think that's weird. I certainly did. But it turns out there's been scientific studies that show the body can and does use photons for energy. There's a process, they're called biophotons that your body produces, and proteins like, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly, but I'll give you a try, melanopsin. And what it does is it transforms light into chemical energy. It's something like photosynthesis that's happening. You might wonder, I certainly noticed this, like in the summer vacation, I'm like at the beach and I'm in the sun and I don't feel hungry. Like obviously I'm having fun. There's reasons why I'm not thinking about food, but it's like, 5-6 hours go by and I'm like, man, I haven't eaten a thing. I'm starving. Part of the reason you're not hungry is because your body is literally getting energy from the sun. Like part of your energy needs you're absorbing from the sun. I didn't know this. I certainly don't think that science goes back to 1913 when Carl Jung was writing this, so it seems prophetic and interesting to me. All right, a little bit more from the Spirit of the Depths. He says, "You think that the solitary is poor. You do not see that he strolls under laden fruit trees. Blossoms swell toward him with abundant buds, and the fruit almost bursts with thronging juices. He cannot tell you, since the splendor of his garden is so abundant. He stammers when he speaks of it. He gives you a small fruit. It appears worthless to you. But if you consider it, you will see that this fruit tastes like a sun, which you could not have dreamt of. And you yourself want to be that solitary who strolls with the sun in his garden. You also see yourself in the totality." So the Spirit of the Depths is telling Jung, you, like the anchorite, see yourself in the totality. You're part of it. It reminds me of a song, "Hey, you're part of it." A band called May. All right, so basically he's saying here that you might think that this solitary monk living in the desert with nothing to his name except for one of the Gospels, like he's poor, right? He's like, no, you don't understand. This guy's filled with God. This guy understands that the lines between himself and God are blurred in ways that you and I will never understand. Like, this guy is not poor. This guy has at his fingertips all the most valuable things. The world, he says, is just abundant buds of fruit bursting at him, He says he can't tell you and you can't see it. Why can he not tell you about this? He says, since the splendor of his garden is so abundant, he stammers when he speaks of it. Now, this is something that scientists have talked about for forever. When people have mystical experiences, they have a difficult time putting it into words. It's called noetic. It has this quality that's hard to describe. It may be impossible to put into words. This is what he's saying. He can't tell you. He stammers when he speaks of it. He can't communicate it to you. if you have not had a mystical experience of your own, if you've not had an encounter with God or become one with God, as the mystics will say that is possible, if that hasn't happened to you, there's no amount of me telling you about it that's going to make any sense to you. You're going to think I'm a madman. And this is what he's saying. He can't tell you about the abundance that he has. It's something that has to be experienced. And then he says he gives you a small fruit, right? He's got this abundance available to him. He's got the infinite available to them, the infinite depths of the unconscious or the infinite God, however you want to put that. But he can't communicate it to you. So what does he do? He gives you a little crumb. He gives you a small fruit. What does that mean? Right? In the vision, it's like a crumb of enlightenment. He's got the full deal, but he can't tell you. What he can do is give you little crumbs, little breadcrumbs. Follow the breadcrumbs. And you look at them and you think, this is nonsense. He says it appears worthless to you. But if you consider it, you will see that the fruit tastes like a sun which you could not have dreamt of. Right? So somebody who's had a mystical experience might tell you something like, I'm God, everything's God, you're God, we're all God. And you think, this is nuts. But if you consider it, it may very well be a fruit that tastes like a sun you could not have dreamt of. And then he says this strange thing, the spirit of the depths. He says, and you yourself want to be that solitary who strolls with the sun in his garden. Now, this is how you know that when he's talking about having the sun within him and all of that, he's talking about God, right? Because there's a biblical reference that's being made here. He's saying, Jung sees the anchorite and wants to be the anchorite. He wants to be the solitary who strolls with the sun in the garden. You might remember from the book of Genesis that God walked with Adam in the garden, right? You want to stroll with the sun in the garden. You want to be with God, to be one with God. This is the symbolism here. Okay, now the spirit of the depths stops talking. We have a little bit more narration that goes like this. You sit and lean against the wall and look at the beautiful, riddlesome totality. The whole lies before you like a book, and you are completely incapable of grasping it. You stretch out your hand, but it remains hanging in invisible webs. You want to see it exactly as it is, but something pushes itself exactly between. All right, so remember, Jung recognizes that he sees himself in the totality, just like the anchorite wants to see himself in the totality. He wants to walk with God in the garden, to be united with God, just like the anchorite does. And you sit there and you look out at the world around you and you realize that this is a greater manifestation of the totality of God. You're a part of it. Everything you see is a part of it. And there's probably an infinite amount beyond what's visible to you or experienceable to you that's also part of it. You look at the totality. It's all around you. It's you. It's within you and all around you. You reach out your hand, but you can't grab it. It's all around you, but you can't grab it. You can't possess it. He says you want to see it exactly as it is, right? You want to see the noumena. You want to see the ones and zeros behind the matrix. You want to see the thing itself. I believe that thing is God. You want to see that. But something pushes itself exactly between you, right? That's the phenomena. The thing that disguises the noumena. The thing that disguises God behind experience. That thing is right in between you. Philosophers call that the veil of perception. And what's interesting about that, this goes back to that thing I was telling you about feeling like, a subject with a perspective, that I am a center of the universe and looking out from my vantage, from my unique perspective at the totality. That thing that I'm referring to when I say your vantage, your consciousness, that's what I'm talking about. The fact that I'm conscious is what makes me feel like an independent self. That's what makes me feel like I have a perspective and I am a center of the universe because I am a subject. So it's consciousness that is the veil that pushes itself between you. it separates us from the totality, if that makes sense. In order for me to be a subject, I have to look at everything else as an object. So there's a separation between subject and object, between me and the world. And how am I ever going to see the totality as long as I have that perspective? I remember I have to get away from it so I can look down on it and see the totality. How can I do that if I'm a self? Maybe I can't. It's being a self. It's being conscious that gets in between you and enlightenment, between you and God. So you remember earlier we were talking about that perhaps a loss of self is somehow necessary, a death and rebirth. So you see that symbolism again. All right, the narration goes on. It says, "The writing lies before you, and always the same, if you believe in words. But if you believe in things, in whose place only words stand, you never come to the end. And yet you must go an endless road, since life flows not only down a finite path, but also an infinite one. But the unbounded is fearful, and your humanity rebels against it. Consequently, you seek limits and restraints so that you do not lose yourself, tumbling into infinity. You cry out for the word which has only one meaning and no other. The word becomes your God, since it protects you from the countless possibilities of interpretation. The word is protective magic against the diamonds of the unending, which want to scatter you to the winds. You speak the magic word, and the limitless is finally banished. Because of that, men seek and make words." Whew, buddy. Oh, buddy. Because, oh boy, I don't even know where to begin. This is my favorite one of the visions, by the way, for today. So clearly when he says, if you believe in things in whose place only words stand, he's referring to the thing in itself, right? The thing that the words are representations of. What is the real thing? And if you grasp the real thing, he says you never come to the end, right? It's infinite. He said, you must go down an endless road, since life flows not only down a finite path. So you might think of that finite path as your own being, which is going to start when you're born and end when you die, let's say. But also an infinite one. So the difference between a finite path, maybe we'll call that your being, and an infinite path, which we'll call being itself, that just goes on and on forever. Now, when we start thinking about that, being itself, the thing in itself, that goes on and on forever, when we start trying to contemplate what eternity and infinity means, he describes it like this. He says, but the unbounded is fearful, and your humanity rebels against it. Right? The moment I start thinking about the infinite, there's an element of fear. Right? The unbounded means it has no boundaries. It can do anything. It's terribly powerful. It's incapable of being understood. It has no end. It goes on forever. It just becomes this infinite blackness that absorbs you. Right? It's terrifying, and that's so different from the world that we pretend to live in, that we've contained in words and in concepts and ideas. And we've contained through Bergson's reducing valve of our consciousness. But if we could peer at the unbounded, we would be terrified. He says, for this reason, we make and seek words. Whew, buddy, remember what I said? We want the illusion because the reality is terrifying. It's too much. He says, consequently, you seek limits and restraints so that you do not lose yourself, tumbling into infinity. See, this is the thing. You remember how I keep saying, to see the totality, it requires coming away from yourself. It requires a symbolic death and rebirth to come out of yourself and back in. And this is exactly what we're afraid of. It's like we seek restraints. We may say we want the totality, but we seek restraints because we're afraid that we'll tumble into infinity. We're afraid that we will die and disappear. And this is This is the crux of mystical experience. To understand that losing yourself, or having an ego death, this is normally how they would describe that having an ego death does destroy yourself. And when it does, you realize that you haven't been destroyed. This ego that's dead isn't you, and you don't know that until it dies. You don't see the totality until the self dies. So there's a symbolic necessity of an ego death. Whew, buddy. So we invent words, ideas to protect ourselves from being confronted by the infinite in the world and within ourselves. As an example, I use the word I, the personal pronoun, to encapsulate what we are, what I am. When in fact, what we are could never be captured in a single letter. What it means to be a conscious subject is literally beyond the scope of our best science. We don't know what consciousness is, why evolution would have supplied us with it in the first place, what it's for, or even how it exists. Conscious experience is the most ubiquitous reality, and yet the most permanent and intractable mystery. All right, back to the narration. He says, the Word created the world and came before the world. It lit up like a light in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Now he's making a reference to the Gospel of John, which says, in the Word was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. So we have this really interesting poetic phrase here. The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. It's just imagining what the darkness must be, that it has the ability to comprehend. A strange way of thinking about the darkness, like a being almost. All right, so he says, the Word created the world and came before it. It lit up like a light in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And thus, the Word should become what the darkness can comprehend, since what use is the light if the darkness does not comprehend it? But your darkness should grasp the light. The darkness does not comprehend the Word, but rather man. Indeed, it seizes him, since he himself is a piece of the darkness. The darkness is your mother. She has power over you, since she gave birth to you. Honor the darkness as the light, and you will illumine your darkness. Man, oh man. So there's a lot there, but you see what I mean. I mean, this sort of, there's like some direction here about like suggestions about what you should do, but really it's like reading a fairy tale or a myth. It's like a prophecy, like reading the prophets from the Bible or the Pythia or some of those ancient Greek. It's strange, right? He says the Word should become what the darkness can comprehend. The Bible says that the darkness couldn't comprehend the light. And Jung says, then the Word should become what the light can comprehend. So this is something that's almost like we should do this. This is something we should do. We should become what the darkness can comprehend. What does that mean? Well, Carl Jung is famous for saying something over and over again. He says that we should make the unconscious conscious. Like our job in developing our soul or psyche is to make more and more of the unconscious conscious within us. We have this infinite depths of whatever the unconscious is, and we can go into it and bring more and more out of it and build ourselves from it and become more and more consciously, right? And he says this is kind of like the meaning of life for Carl Jung, to make the unconscious conscious. And something like he's saying here, the Word should become what the darkness can comprehend, to make the unconscious conscious. And then he says, your darkness should grasp the light. The darkness does not comprehend the Word, but rather man. Indeed, it seizes him, since he himself is a piece of the darkness. See, now we're told we're a piece of the darkness. Of course, we we should understand it if it's a part of us, shouldn't we? It's kind of strange to have a part of us that we don't understand or comprehend. Then he says, not only are you a piece of the darkness is your mother. It's the thing that gave birth to you. Remember earlier where I was talking about Jung believes that unconsciousness is this sort of fundamental reality, and consciousness emerges from it, that the unconscious gives birth to consciousness. And so what he seems to be saying here is that you are a part of the darkness. You are both conscious and unconscious. And where you came from is this source of consciousness. That's your mother. The darkness that you're a piece of, is also your source and origin. And he says this interesting thing at the end. He says, honor the darkness as the light, and you will illumine your darkness. So I just can't help but think from the Ten Commandments, we're told to honor thy mother. And he says, honor the darkness, who is our mother. Isn't that interesting? So you are a piece of the darkness that gave birth to you. It's paradoxical, isn't it? As it should be when we're talking about God or the Ouroboros. What is the darkness? It's the totality. It's the unconscious. It's God. It's something like that. Simultaneously, you and not you. Because the totality is you and also not you. And it doesn't comprehend the light, right? The light is always associated with consciousness. We even call it the light of consciousness. When we're conscious, we can see the light. We see by the light, right? So there's a connection here between light and consciousness. When it says it does not comprehend the light, because the light, well, what does light do? Certainly from the biblical perspective, light separates from the dark. Light is the thing that divides the light from the dark. So you see that it sees itself as distinct from the all. That's what consciousness does, right? It's the totality is the light and the dark. Consciousness is just the light. So it looks at itself and it looks at the dark, and it doesn't see itself in the dark. It doesn't realize that this unconscious thing, that this darkness is also itself, because light separates the light from the dark. And this is an analogy for the separation between God and man. And we read in the Bible things like man is made in the image of God. It helps us to get closer to this idea that there's a separation between God and man in the same way as there's a separation between the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the dark. And our task as embodiments of the light, so to speak, is to integrate the darkness into us, to embody it, to recognize that we cannot be separated, and to pretend otherwise is just that. Pretend. We integrate the darkness in order to understand it as ourselves, right? We're a piece of the darkness. And as our mother, as our source and origin. All right, the last bit of the narration here goes like this. If you comprehend the darkness, it seizes you. Through comprehending the dark, the nocturnal, the abyssal in you, you become utterly simple. And you sleep down into the womb of the millennia, and your walls resound with ancient temple chants, since the simple is what always was. Man, my hair stands up on my arms. All right, so firstly, if you comprehend the darkness, if you make the unconscious conscious, what happens? He says the darkness seizes you. What does that mean? It means something like this. To know God, to comprehend God, is to be God, right? It seizes you. It grabs a hold of you. You become one with the thing. So he's saying something like this. To comprehend the darkness requires that you become the darkness. This is what he means by making the unconscious conscious. He says, by comprehending the darkness, you become utterly simple. What does he mean by that? Well, I've seen that language a lot in the pre-Socratics. When they say simple, they mean, you can't break it down to anything smaller. You get something fundamental. You get something like the thing that makes up the world, the oneness of the monad, as they would call it. You become utterly simple. But then he tells you what that means. He says, since the simple is what always was. Okay, what is the thing that always was? That's the eternal. That's the infinite. That's God. So when it says, when you comprehend the dark, you become utterly simple. You become what always was. What does that mean? You become God. This is the unity with God that religious people will call things like apotheosis or theosis if you're an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And Jung calls this same idea wholeness, to become the totality. Wholeness. To recognize your own divinity. All right, that brings me to the next vision, which I'm going to call Inception, Mirrors Reflecting a Life. The reason I call it Inception is because this is a dream within a dream that starts to happen. So let me narrate kind of how this opens. So Jung sleeps another night, and he dreams within a dream. Now in this dream, he's in a dark gorge, like a really deep valley, and it's pitch black. It's just covered in night. He can't see anything. And then just barely in the distance, he starts to see on the eastern horizon a white horse with golden wings. And he knows it's the chariot of Apollo. He knows it's bringing the sun. And the horse speaks to him, and he says, "Hail him who is in darkness, since the day is over him." And Helios approaches, the darkness begins to retreat. And Jung sees the darkness as 1,000 black serpents, like just crawling away down into these holes in the earth. And Jung cries, "Give us your light," and wakes up. It's weird, right? So a couple things. We start to see some of this ancient Greek imagery showing up, which is interesting. The horse speaking to him, which is interesting. But what the horse says, he says, "Hail him who is in darkness, since the day is over him." And basically what he's saying is, like, it's good that you're in darkness. You should be glad that you're in darkness, because what that means is you're about to see the light. The day is over you. It's coming. And I can't help but think that sounds a lot like the Beatitudes from the Bible, the words of Jesus when he said things like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Right? It's like, it's a good thing that you're poor in spirit because the kingdom of heaven is yours. It's good. It's good that you're covered in darkness because the day is coming. Something like that. And then the next thing I want to focus on are these, like the night becomes serpents, all this darkness around him, like he's covered in this darkness that he now sees as it's pulling away and being replaced by the light. It's slithering into these countless black serpents down into the ground. So you've got the serpents associated with darkness, and you might wonder why serpents. Obviously, my mind goes to the myth of the Garden of Eden from the Bible, because it can be seen. I mean, that story of the Garden of Eden can be seen or interpreted as the story of the birth of consciousness. Right? We talk about original sin being the eating of the apple against the command of God. But what that does, what eating of the apple does, is to reveal to Adam and Eve that they're naked. It shows them as self-conscious beings for the first time, aware of their own nakedness. So original sin is often understood as the birth of consciousness, when Adam and Eve became conscious beings after eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And the serpent, of course, is the bringer of light. Because remember, the serpent brings the light of consciousness to Adam and Eve. And the bringer of light in Latin is Lucis Fer, right? Lucifer. And this is where we get the connection between the serpent and the devil. So the black serpents are symbols of unconsciousness. And their retreat into the earth is a symbol of the dawning of consciousness. Just the same as it's a symbol of the dawning of the day. All right, so there's a strange scene that happens after this where Jung is basically taking his morning stroll through the desert, waiting for the anchorite to come back, and he encounters various things as he's walking around, and he basically starts saying prayers to everything he encounters. And he keeps getting struck by this idea that the desert demands prayer. That's what he's saying. So he's walking around, he sees a scarab beetle, right, another Egyptian symbol, pushing a ball of dung through the desert. And he says to the beetle, "Dear scarab, my father, I honor you. Blessed be your work in eternity. Amen." A little while later, he sees these reddened stones on the ground, baked from the sun, and he says, "Oh, mother stone, I love you. I lie snuggled up against your warm body, your late child. Blessed be you, ancient mother." And then he basically stops himself and he's like, what am I saying? How everything appears so animated to me, right? So just understand that Jung has, again, woken up in the grave. He has this symbolic rebirth. He goes out into the desert and he starts to see things, and he can't help but be struck by the fact that the life that's in them, or the being that's in them, is something like his own. Like everything seems to be alive. This is something that people who have mystical experience will often say as sort of a lingering effect of the experience, where things seem to be animated and filled with life. Some of our most ancient religions, our tribal religions, are like this. They call them animism for the same reason, because they see everything, the rivers, the trees, the sky, the earth, as alive. All right, so the story progresses where Jung eventually reunites with the anchorite. And the anchorite starts telling him this story from when he was younger. And he encountered this old man who was trying to evangelize him. Basically, he was sharing with him the gospel of Jesus. And the story is told in such a way that the anchorite wasn't a Christian. This was the first time he had been introduced to the idea of Jesus. And as the old man is speaking and telling him about Jesus, the anchorite keeps insisting that the story he's telling is not of Jesus. The story he's telling is an Egyptian myth. The story of the resurrecting God is Osiris, and the story of the Savior is the Son of God, and the Savior is Horus, Osiris' son. And it's like he can't understand that this is like a retelling. Like, what's going on here? What are you doing? What are you saying? And as he's telling the story to Jung says, "Don't you think that Christianity could be a transformation of your Egyptian teachings?" And the anchorite says, "If you say that your old teachings, that our old teachings were less adequate expressions of Christianity, then I'm more likely to agree with you." And Jung says, "Yes, but do you then assume that the history of religions is aimed at a final goal?" And the anchorite says, "It's erroneous to believe that religions differ in their innermost essence. Strictly speaking, it's always one and the same religion. Every subsequent form of religion is the meaning of the antecedent." All right, so let me stop for a second and tell you what all this means. So he basically starts off saying there's these weird similarities between Christianity and ancient Egyptian myth. Is it possible that they're a retelling of the same story? And then he says, Jung asks, do you then assume that the history of religion is aimed at a final goal? And what this implies is that as religions change and evolve over the course of history, that they're actually evolving. They're actually changing. Like Jung has this idea of circumambulation. And it's like you have a certain... I don't know how to explain this succinctly. You have a particular goal. Maybe you don't even know what that is, but your interests keep taking you like from this subject to that subject, and basically you're bouncing around as your interest is taking you from one thing to the next, always getting a little closer to that goal, but never quite getting there. And so it takes you to something that gets you closer still, and something that gets you closer still. And the image that you see is like a spiral. You're starting off on the periphery, and you're moving closer and closer to the middle as you go around. That's circumambulation. So the idea here is, and Jung would speak about this like with our own psyche and our own personality, that's what we're doing. You might, see people that are doing things that you think are noble, the way they're behaving, the way they're acting. You may see other people that are doing things that you think are no good. And even just the examples that you see of people, things that you gravitate towards and things that you recoil from, even that is a kind of circumambulation, right? It's bringing you closer to those behaviors and personality types that you think are honorable and good, and away from those things that you think are bad, and you're slowly kind of narrowing in on something that's going to be your unique self or psyche or personality, something like that. Well, the idea is that maybe this is something that happens with religion, that over time, religion is circumambulating. It's getting closer and closer to something, some truth about God. And then he says a strange thing. He says, basically every religion in its essence is the same, and every subsequent form of religion is the meaning of the one that came before. Every new religion is the meaning of the religion that came before it. And you see like a creature evolving into the next creature. It's like what came before it. You had this development in religion, potentially, the same as you do with biology. And that might sound strange to you, but I don't have to dig deep to give you examples of this. If new religions are born from the interpretation of older ones, certainly Buddhism is an example, because Buddha was a Hindu, and Buddhism emerged from that. Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and Christianity was born from that. So is it possible that each iteration is more conscious and more explicit than its predecessor? That each one is circumambulating, getting closer to something? That Christianity was born from Judaism and Buddhism was born from Hinduism? Right? It's an interesting idea. And at this point, Jung starts to feel himself waking up. And by that, I mean like waking up from his active imagination. He starts to feel himself pulling out of this reverie that he's in. And it goes like this. He says, "But day is about to break, actual day, the day of this world. How can I pray to the sun? Why should I pray to it? I drink the sun within me, so why should I pray to it? In the day of this world, I forget that I drank the sun and am drunk from its active light. No sooner do you touch the earth than your inner life is over. It flees from you into things. If you watch closely, you will see that things live your life and that they live off you. Nothing happens in which you are not entangled in a secret manner, for everything has ordered itself around you and plays your innermost." All right. Well, that brings us to the next vision, but I think that requires a little bit of a deeper dive. He says, "How can I pray to the sun? Why should I pray to it? I drink the sun within me, so why should I pray to it?" Okay, so remember, the sun is the sun, but it's also a representation of Ra. It's God. It's the creator. He's basically saying, if you're saying that I am part of the totality, that I have God within me, right? I am part of the totality. I am God. I am part of it. Why should I pray to God if I have God within me? Right? He says, I drink the sun within me. I have God within me. So why should I pray to it? And then he says, in the day of this world, I forget that I drank the sun and am drunk from its light. This, I think, is beautiful. When he says in the day of this world, I forget, he's talking about when I come out of this active imagination and I'm back in my sober, ordinary state of mind. I forget that I'm God. You know, when I'm coming down from the mystical experience, then I forget I have the sun within me, that I have God within me, that I'm drunk from its light. That part I love so much, because to be drunk, right? This has an association with the word spirits. This is how the ancients used to think when they were drunk, that they were possessed by the spirit, by the god of Dionysus or whatever it is. So to say that he's drunk from the sun means that he's possessed by God, right? He is possessed by the spirit of the sun. He has it within him. And this is so close to this idea that I toy with and I really like, that what it is that animates life, what life is God. So when we talk about God or when we talk about the spirit within us from a religious perspective, I think that is literally God in us, in the same way that Jung is describing it. That is the thing that's responsible for the fact that I'm alive and animated and conscious and all of that. None of that would be possible without God. And so when you It says, in the day of this world, when you come back into your ordinary consciousness, you forget that you are literally animated by God, that your life and being is God. You forget that thing. He says, no sooner do you touch the earth, right? Return to normal consciousness, then your inner life is over. Then you lose the totality. You lose all the stuff you gained in that mystical experience when you were one with God. You lose the totality. You become yourself a subject with a perspective again. And all of the totality that's not you flees into things, becomes the world again. Carl Jung talked about this. It was a very interesting way. He basically said that the things you are not conscious of, you project into the world. So this is this psychological idea of projection. You're projecting on me. You're projecting. That's what he means by that. The things that you are unconscious of in yourself, you project out into the world. Now imagine if it's not just that you project them into the world, like if I'm cheating on my spouse, I'm yelling at her and accusing her of cheating on me, that's projecting. But what if the projection itself is not just this secret I'm keeping, but it's the unity of all things. Like I forget that I and my wife are not distinct from each other, that we're the same thing. We're one in God and part of this totality together. That I forget that the whole world around me is a projection of this of the unconscious things in me. You and the world and all the objects around me, that in that mystical experience, in that totality, those things are me. But when I come back into my ordinary state of consciousness, they don't seem like me anymore. They seem like objects. Right now I'm a subject and they all seem like objects again. So I lose them into the world. So it's an interesting idea because it makes you wonder if the world is, if the phenomenal world that we see out there is not the noumena, it's not the real thing, the thing in itself. What does it mean that it might be a projection? Like an illusion that I'm creating or that we're creating collectively. It's very interesting. It's a rabbit hole we can't go down right now, but interesting. And Carl Jung says this interesting thing often about this idea of projection. He says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Right? Because it doesn't seem like it's you. And the influences don't seem to belong to you, so you call it fate. Now, if you make the unconscious conscious, then it becomes you. Then you're the one in control. Something like that. This is one of the reasons why making the unconscious conscious is so powerful. All right, let's see. He says, if you watch closely, you will see that things live your life. They live off you. This is an interesting idea too, because it's connected with this idea of the totality and also this idea of being a subject and having this conscious state that seems to separate you from the totality. Because it separates you as the subject from the world as objects. And it's like all things are objects in the drama of your life. And right there, all the things in the world are your experiences. At least to you, that's how they seem. You don't know what else they are, but at least they are your experiences, right? You're the star of the show. Jung says, nothing happens in which you are not entangled in a secret manner, for everything has ordered itself around you. That's what consciousness does. It orders the world around you as the center, as the subject, as the thing looking out at it. And of course, this idea of entanglement is an interesting one. We could probably go down that rabbit hole, but I won't. The fact that we are secretly entangled with everything else, that might be a poetic statement, but it's also a true statement of quantum physics in a manner of speaking, this idea of entanglement of particles and so forth. So another little bit of a sort of interesting prophetic fact, which brings us to the final vision, which I'm going to call On the Precipice in the Borderland. All right, so this is a new vision. Jung finds himself in a place where a stream and the sky meet the sea. Everything comes together. It's a dark place, and in the distance he sees a dark figure in a dark coat. And that figure seems to represent the boundary of all things. There's a video game that I loved growing up called Chrono Trigger, and a Super Nintendo game. There was a scene where you go to the future as far as you can. You go to this place where time stops, and this is what comes to my mind when I read this. This place that's the boundary of all things. But he again, there's this figure standing there. So Jung does what Jung does. He walks up and he starts talking to him, and he asks him if he can stand beside him. And the stranger says, "What leads you here to me, you living matter?" And Jung says, "My strange and unexpected path led me here as I happily followed the way of the living stream. I gather this is your rightful place." The stranger says, "Yes, here it leads into the undifferentiable, where none is equal or unequal, but all are one with one another." All right, so right there you can see this place where the living stream meets the sea, and the sky touches the sea. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but I live near Lake Erie, and on certain days when it's cloudy, you cannot tell where the horizon is. You cannot tell the distinction between the sky and the lake, and it's beautiful and eerie at the same time. No pun intended. So this is this place where all things melt together. And he says it leads to the undifferentiable, where everything's mixed together. He says nothing is equal or unequal. All are one with one another. Right? This is the totality. This is the oneness idea. It's also interesting to note that the sea that we're up against here is a symbol of the unconscious and of God. Very often in myths and fairy tales and dream interpretation, water has an association with the unconscious, especially deep, dark water, like a sea or ocean. So, but we also have the Egyptian goddess Nun, who's the watery chaos, the god from which all of creation comes. And we have a similar story in Mesopotamia with Tiamat, the goddess of the salt water. So you can kind of see these examples that just basically reinforce that the sea is this idea associated with creator gods, but also with the unconscious. Right? It's where all water becomes the sea. Right? This is the place where the living and differentiated become the undifferentiated. This is why he says he's followed the living stream to the sea where everything becomes undifferentiable. The living water goes into the conscious water goes into the unconscious ocean. And everything becomes one. This is the idea of unity with God, or Jung would call this psychological wholeness. And then he says this, he says, "The sun still glowed in me, but I could feel myself stepping into the great shadow." So remember, he has God within him. That's the warmth of his body was replaced by the warmth of the sun. If you remember, he's like, I can still feel this glowing in me, but he says I can feel myself stepping into the shadow. Right? Something like stepping into the sea, where he's going to be washed away, where he's going to, what did he say earlier? How did he describe that earlier? What did he say? Something like just, I'm gonna basically washed away into the infinite, or erased into the oneness, something like that. This is like a symbolic death, or right on the precipice of death, which is why I called this on the precipice. Let's see. All right, so the sun still glowed in me, but I could feel myself stepping into the great shadow. I follow the stream that makes its way into the depths of what is to come. When I comprehend my darkness, a truly magnificent night came over me, and my dream plunged me into the depths of the millennia, and from it my phoenix ascended. Right, so this idea of stepping into that darkness and getting washed away. So this plunged him into the depths of the millennia from where his phoenix ascended. And again, you have this repeated imagery of rebirth when we're talking about the phoenix rising. So the idea of entering this undifferentiated abyss, entering the sea, entering God, or oneness with God, and reemerging as a new being, as a phoenix from its ashes. This is something that Jung might call individuation or self-realization or something like that. In fact, he did call this conjunctio in one of his main books, the idea of union with God, or this idea of wholeness. And then he says, did you ever think of the evil in you? Oh, you spoke of it, and you confessed it smilingly. But did you know what evil is, and that it stands precisely right behind your virtues? That it's also your virtues themselves? Well, there's something interesting there. So this is the idea of the part of you that's unconscious. And one of the greatest examples of this is what Jung would call the shadow. These are these impulses in us that we subdue and we pretend they don't exist. Maybe they're violent impulses or sexual impulses or whatever. These things that we bury down and subdue for social cohesion, right? So we get along with people in society. But burying those things and making them unconscious kind of makes them adversarial to you. Remember, if I can't make those conscious, then they're going to have an influence over me that I'm going to call fate, right? So he asks, do you ever think of your evil? Do you ever think of those things that you bury that are unconscious in you? Did you know that they stand right behind your virtues and are your virtues? And this is interesting, man. This is like saying that the evil in you is something that comes from your virtues and may be identical to them. And we know this, that vices and virtues are opposites. And just like any opposites, you can't have one without the other. You can't. You can't have light without day. It doesn't work that way. You must have them together, or you have neither. And this is the case with these virtues and evil he's talking about. You can't have one without the other. You can't have love without hate. And a good way of understanding how virtues can become vices and vice versa is, well, we all know we're talking about love and hate. Love can make people do terrible things, crazy things. It can make you do things you didn't think you would do. It has, in many cases, resulted in murder. You know, I love you so much, and I've given my whole life to you, and then I find out you're cheating on me and don't give a shit about me, and I make a terrible decision. I could never hate you enough to choke the life out of you in this strange example if I didn't love you so much. You see what I mean? You see what I mean? That there's this strange paradox that we see here of the union of opposites, this Ouroboros idea. And I'm reminded of a quote from the Bible, from Isaiah 45:7. It goes like this. God says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. Did you hear that? I make the light and the darkness, good and evil. God is responsible for them both. And we recoil from that. You know, many Christians recoil from that. No, God is not evil, but I just showed you how vice and virtue are the same thing. They're the same thing. All right, he says, you locked Satan in the abyss for a millennium, and you laughed at him, since he had become a children's fairy tale. You know, it goes on, but basically what he's saying, we pretend that the darkness in us doesn't exist. Like I was saying before, things that we push down and pretend aren't a part of us. So effectively we do this that they take on an identity of their own, right? They're projected into the world. And the symbol that we project this onto, we call Satan or Lucifer or something like that. It's as long as it remains an unintegrated part of us, then it becomes adversarial to us. You know, that's what Satan means, the adversary. If only we'd chosen not to shrink away from this part of ourselves, not to separate or divide ourself from ourself, then integration would be possible. And Satan tamed and at our command And if we do not take command by asserting ourselves as the master of all we are, then our projection takes command of us. It seizes us, right? That's what the anchorite said. And again, I'm reminded of Jung's famous quote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And it goes on, it says, with horror you see that you are defenseless. You seize the evil and your virtues cross over to him. It is unacceptable, the awfully repulsive, that which I forever rejected, that rises in me. For if the wretchedness and poverty of this life ends, another life begins in what is opposed to me. I curse the hour of my birth 7 times, and I do not choose to kill myself on the spot. I prepare to experience the hour of my second birth. The ancients said, inter feces et iranas nascimur, which is Latin for we are born from filth. Literally, we are born from feces and urine. For 3 nights I was assaulted by the horrors of birth. Then life began to stir again. This is an important point he's making. He's talking again about the second birth and being born again, and this is the transformation that's painful. It's always painful. And this is why he says, if I do not choose to kill myself on the spot, I prepare to experience the hour of my second birth. Right? If the pain involved in this transformation is too much, then I might just end it all. But if I push through, then I'll become something new. And transformation is painful because it forces us to acknowledge that we're insufficient. And we so strongly identify with our ego that being insufficient is something that we can't deal with. It strikes us like a whip. We must say, I am not enough. Admit that. And then become enough. We must become enough. We must rise to the occasion. And that's what that rebirth symbolizes. And it comes from the deepest, darkest places. You know, if you've known anybody that's, transformed their body, like they got really fat, lost a bunch of weight or something, or maybe they had drug addiction that they were able to kind of get out from under, and some great transformation and rebirth, they'll be the first to tell you that you have to hit often rock bottom. You have to get into the filth to find what you need to be reborn. And imagine if you didn't have to be dragged kicking and screaming into that. Imagine if you understood, like Jung does, that the filth, the darkness is within you. It's accessible to you, that you can plumb it and mine it. You can go in and find those things that you need to build yourself, to make yourself sufficient. Whatever it is you need. And that brings me to my conclusion. In our first vision, we met the anchorite, who forces Jung to see a distinction between symbols and their meaning. He warns us not to accept symbols in place of the things they represent, for to do so is to willingly accept an illusion in place of reality, to be blind to reality. It may be simpler, and we may yearn for that simplicity, but it is poison nonetheless. While this warning applies generally, the anchorite is a religious symbol in Jung's vision and emphasizes this human tendency in the religious domain. Logos, he tells us, is just a word, a dead thing, a husk to be filled. But when we recognize the logos as a living force embodied in the world, then we have filled the husk, so to speak. Then we've got at the thing itself. From here, Jung enters the second and I think most significant vision. Here the anchorite tells him he is a piece of the darkness and that the darkness is his mother. By this he means that Jung is more than he takes himself to be. He is himself, of course, but also much beyond. He extends unknown depths into the unconscious and into the world. In order for Jung to understand what he truly is, in order for him to encounter the thing itself, and not merely a dead symbol, he must see the big picture, so to speak, the totality. He must understand himself as the matrix of all things, which includes him. The anchorite meditates on the totality of things, trying to step away from himself in order to grasp the whole of which he is a part. Not merely the light, but the darkness too. What unfolds next is tantamount to a confession. The anchorite tells him, quote, "The unbound is fearful, and your humanity rebels against it." But what the anchorite calls the unbounded is the very same thing he called the darkness. It is unbounded because it is unconscious. We cannot impose on it the limiting power of our consciousness or stuff it into a symbol. Therefore, it is frightening and alien. It could be anything, and because we don't know it, we fear it and recoil from it. But remember, we are a piece of the darkness, right? So are we to reject what we are? Why should we recoil from ourselves? The anchorite warns, quote, "You seek limits and restraints so that you do not lose yourself, tumbling into infinity. You cry out for the word which has one meaning and no other." See, in this, he's showing us how we reject ourself, paradoxically, by trying to preserve our sense of self. We cannot embrace the darkness, even if it's part of us, even if it's most of us, because we'd be trading a stable, finite ego for a terrifying, infinite totality. And do tell, just where the hell am I in the infinite totality? Aren't I lost? And so, when we cry out for a word which has one meaning and no other, we are begging for illusion. We are saying that we prefer dead symbols to the real thing. The anchorite recognizes this when he says, quote, "The word is protective magic against the diamonds of the unending." Man, listen to what he's saying. He's saying that trading symbols for reality and rejecting the darkness in us protects us from the demons of the unending. What is that? The diamonds or demons of the unending. That's the spirit of infinity. That's God, baby. We literally choose illusion in order to hide from God, in order to keep God at bay, to shield ourselves from the awesome reality of our own true selves. We run from ourselves and give ourselves chase. In the third and fourth visions, the symbolic cat gets out of the bag and is on full display. The content of the vision becomes explicitly religious. The dream world around Jung seems suddenly imbued with life and intention, right down to the stones at his feet. He can sense his own life reverberating in them and is struck by a sense of unity and expansion of his conscious state. And this brings him to a precipice, a borderline, where the river meets the sea. He follows the water of the living and stops just where those waters dissolve into the infinite. He feels a stirring within him, a longing, a calling. It seems he's being called into the ocean, being called to become one with the ocean, which of course requires that he sacrifice himself. What will he do? Will he enter? We cannot say, as this is where the vision ends. So what does it all mean? I'm reminded again of this idea of the darkness within, of the infinite within, and of ourselves being part of that darkness and born from it. This seems to imply that we are a reservoir of tremendous power and potential, but our fear and rejection of it keeps us from knowing this and from harnessing it. Jung said, quote, He who comprehends the darkness in himself, to him the light is near. He also said, quote, through comprehending the dark in you, you become what always was. Man, when I read this, I can't help but wonder what potential the darkness holds. I wonder what it would mean to embrace it. And when I do, a verse of Scripture comes to mind which just might offer a glimpse. I ask, what does the darkness hold? And allow God to answer. Again, from Isaiah 45:3, God says, I will give thee the treasures of darkness.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.